Hello and good evening all. Tonight we're going back to the golden days of the 30s again to look at one of BMW's first iconic models, and arguably the car that laid the fundamental groundwork for a brand language and identity that has continued to this day. The first BMW 328. In 1935, BMW was still in its early days as an auto manufacturer. They had started out making aeroplanes and their engines before moving into producing agricultural equipment, motorcycles, and other various products after the First World War and Germany wasn't really allowed to make airplanes anymore. They continued in this until 1928, when they purchased the Fahrzeugfabrik Eisenach, which was manufacturing a license-built Austin 7 branded as a Dixie. That's D-I-X-I, not D-I-X-I-E, the well-known paper plates brand in the US, or the colloquial name for the southern part of the United States during the Confederate period. The new ownership updated the vehicle with Bosch shock absorbers, which is very hard to say 5 times fast, and regionalization adjustments, specifically swapping to left-hand drive and metric hardware. Additional updates in 1929, 30, and 31 saw improvements to the brakes, larger tires, additional body styles, including a sports version, the Wartburg, the disappearance of the Dixie nameplate, and in its final version, independent front suspension. The license to produce the vehicle expired in 1932, and BMW replaced it with their first homegrown model, the 3/20, followed shortly by the 303, their first straight-six model, and the first to feature their now omnipresent kidney grille. As much as I have in other videos railed on the current generation of M3 and M4 for having what I consider to be a horribly oversized and overstyled kidney grille design, a comment which I would actually extend to most of their current range, looking at you, iX and XM, there's no denying the original is even more substantial. At the same time, it's much better integrated into the bodywork, and I generally like the pre-war styling aesthetics from the 20s and 30s. But I digress. The 303 line was developed into BMW's first true performance cars in 1934 and 35, the 315/1 and 319/1, which sported straight sixes of 1.5 and 1.9 liters respectively. These were both uprated from the saloons upon which they were based, with the former making, I think, about 45 horsepower and the latter making about 55. Come mid-1935, however, BMW was back to considering another comprehensive revamp of their model lineup, launching the 326 in 1936, which continued to use the 1.9-liter, 55-horsepower engine from the 319/1 in a new box-frame platform that facilitated considerable flexibility in the development of new models. Originally, I was going to call this Die erste neue Klasse, but that small contribution to the latter part of the Wirtschaftswunder, actually arguably more a result of it, involved a new engine in addition to a new chassis design, so bang goes that connection. The 326 did sell fairly well and was highly praised for its innovative features such as torsion bar rear suspension and hydraulic brakes, but the market was not ill-supplied with medium and large sedans at the time, and many consumers were more interested in smaller, sportier vehicles, which led to the 327. Meanwhile, the new engine that hadn't debuted with the new chassis was in the works elsewhere, to become the beating heart of the 328. The 328 was intended to stand companion to the larger 326 and 327 as a more competition-focused model, going up against the then-dominant Alfa Romeos and Bugattis in the 2-liter class at endurance and road races like Le Mans, the Mille Miglia, and the Targa Florio. Intent on getting the most out of the engine within the class limits, the 1.9-liter straight-six was bored out another millimeter to give a displacement of 1.971 liters or 1,971 cc. Adjustments to the valves and combustion chambers further improved performance, but also required the design of a new aluminum cross-flow cylinder head. That's when the budget started to get a bit constrained, and running out of time and money, they retained the in-block camshaft design from the M78 engine upon which the new power plant was based. This in-block camshaft, combined with the cross-flow head, necessitated a transverse pushrod connection between the intake and exhaust valves, which gave the engine the outward appearance of a dual overhead camshaft design. But it wasn't a dual overhead camshaft design. Tricksy little Bavarians indeed. This mechanically complex solution caused some not inconsiderable skepticism amongst the contemporaneous motoring press, but the BMW engineers felt confident in their decision, and they weren't swimming in cash at the point, so they didn't really have much choice. Breathing through 3 Solex downdraft carburetors, the powerplant, creatively dubbed the M328, was good for 80 horsepower at 5,000 RPM in its original form. Power went to the rear wheels, naturally, through a 4-speed manual sourced from either ZF or Herth, assuming Google Translate got everything right from that German article, and much of the other underlying design features were carried over from the 319 and iteratively improved. For instance, while the 319/1 retained a generally 1920s, early 30s aesthetic with its separate potted headlamps, the kidney grille making up the entire front fascia, and highly distinct front fenders, the 328 embraced the streamlining fashions of the 30s in a big way. To be fair, both cars did share faired-in rear wheel covers. These weren't always retained in competition, particularly for the 328, but the grille had shrunk substantially. The hood was longer, and the headlamps were now integrated and served as a bridge between the fenders and main body, while the front fenders themselves far more tightly enveloped the front wheels, creating a generally more cohesive aesthetic compared to its predecessor. The bodywork was aluminum, and thus the whole car was quite lightweight, tipping the scales at only 830 kilos or 1,830 pounds. Front suspension was independent with wishbones and a transverse leaf spring, while rear suspension was a live axle again, this time with leaf springs and longitudinal torsion bars, although a live axle is a far more appropriate option for the 1930s than the 1970s, Mr. Decon Monza. All 4 wheels had hydraulic drum brakes, advertised as, I'm probably exceeding the limits of my German here, Vierrad-Flüssigkeitsfußbremse, and literally translates as 4-wheel fluid foot brakes, which is quite descriptively accurate, and to me slightly amusingly so. I would love it if rather than hydraulic brakes we got fluid foot brakes. Top speed was reported about 150 kph or 93 miles an hour. It's also worth noting, of course, that all of this development was occurring concurrently, actually that feels slightly semantically redundant, you be the judge, with the opening stages of the big budget Grand Prix and outright speed wars that were being fought between Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union with their W25s, 125s, and Type A's, B's, and C's. Unlike Mercedes and not yet Audi, however, BMW was not, to the best of my knowledge, in receipt of any Reich funding to support their racing efforts, perhaps because the world's most off-the-rails Charlie Chaplin impersonator wasn't particularly interested in sports cars over Grand Prix racing, although not that the lines were particularly strong in those days, but maybe he just didn't like Bavaria as much as he liked Saxony or Baden-Württemberg. Anyway, though the 328 was not available for sale to the general public until spring 1937, the first prototype 328 made its racing debut at the Eifelrennen in 1936, where, driven by famed BMW motorcycle pilot Ernst Henner, it cruised home to an easy class victory in the rain, 2.5 minutes ahead of the next best Alfa Romeo, putting to rest those doubts about the functionality of the unconventional power plant, and proving both the car's excellence and Henner's versatility, as prior to that weekend he had no experience driving around the Nürburgring. 2 weeks subsequent, with another prototype complete, Henner led the BMW squad again at the 1936 French Grand Prix, which, after the 1935 race saw only 1 French entrant and an absolute walkover by the Mercedes team, ran with modified rules so that it was essentially a sports car race to ensure French success. This precluded Mercedes and Auto Union's cars from competition, as they were now outside the rules, and left BMW as the only German entrants. Both 328s succumbed early to reliability issues, not entirely unsurprising given the youth of the cars, but this did bring improvements to the drivetrain in the off-season, which were also integrated into the production vehicles, and meant that the cars performed much better in 1937. Available to the general public for sale with a list price of 7,400 Reichsmarks, it was certainly aimed at the well-heeled motorist. Even the 326 was about 2,000 Reichsmarks cheaper, but the 328 proved nonetheless popular amongst those who valued driving dynamics over vehicle size, and it was also well reviewed as a long-distance tourer, but its biggest impact was incontrovertibly on track. 1937 saw the car reportedly rack up over 100 class wins in everything from regional events across Deutschland up to the RAC Tourist Trophy, a result it would repeat in 1938, a year which also brought a class win in the Mille Miglia, BMW's first. Many of these wins, particularly the regional ones, came from private individuals, some of them running coach-built bodies rather than the original factory bodywork, and 1939 saw the factory get into the custom bodywork mood as well, with their lead entry at the 1939 French endurance kerfuffle sporting an even lighter and more streamlined body alongside two conventionally built entries, with all engines tuned up to a bit north of 100 horsepower. This race was in many ways a race of aerodynamics, with outright victory going to the Bugatti Type 57C tank. While some argue that the Delage D6 3-liter that finished second deserved the victory, that's a story for a different time. BMW's Streamliner outstripped the other two 328s and the other 2-liter class competitors, finishing 5th overall behind the aforementioned Bugatti and Delage, as well as two Lagonda 4.5-liter V12s. BMW's two other cars finished 2nd and 3rd in class, the marque's best result in the sport to date. Of course, the unhinged Charlie Chaplin impersonator's decision to invade Poland and then France put an end to both most motor vehicle production and to racing, as more and more countries were drawn into the war, and 1940 saw BMW's motorsport participation limited to the Axis powers, or privateer running in neutral countries. Their main effort that season was thus an entry in the Mille Miglia, or what stood for it that year, a race running a much smaller triangular route between Brescia, Cremona, and Mantua, rather than the traditional round trip from Brescia to Rome, nominally in the interests of safety after the fatalities of the 1938 race. This change to the route also resulted in a nominal name change to the Gran Premio di Brescia, but it still counts as a Mille Miglia for historical retrospectives. BMW sent a 5-strong team to northern Italy for the event, and essentially it was a race between the Italian and German manufacturers. Alfa Romeo was heavily favored to win despite the loss of their team manager, one Enzo Ferrari, who had hung out his own shingle under the name Auto Avio Costruzioni and entered his first all-Enzo automobile, the Tipo 815. But the hasty construction of the cars meant that the two entries struggled mechanically and failed to finish despite leading their class for much of the race. 4 2.5-liter Alfa Romeos held up their marque's honor, with Clemente Biondetti leading the squad, while BMW's entries were split between 3 328 Roadsters with lightened bodywork and up-tuned engines to make at least 120 horsepower, the Le Mans-winning touring coupe from the previous year, and a new Rennlimousine designed by, or at least inspired by, Wunibald Kamm's aerodynamic principles. This Rennlimousine sported a hyper-lightweight magnesium alloy body that weighed a mere 30 kilos, and I think looked quite good. It was driven by a Count Giovanni Lorani, and it was the only one of the BMW entries that failed to finish, due to a breakdown in the lubrication system. The Alfa entries, like the Ferrari not Ferrari, were also relatively rapid assemblies and suffered throughout the race as a result, only able to achieve their best finish in second, the car driven by Farina and Mambelli. BMW went 1, 3, 5, and 6 with their other 4 cars, led by the 29-year-old Huschka von Hanstein and Walter Baumer in the Le Mans Coupe, breaking the speed record for the race in the process. But, of course, the much shorter and simpler course meant that record-breaking went in the record books with an asterisk. The Mille Miglia win was the 328's last major victory before the war really kicked off in earnest, and was a huge coup for BMW, coming in with essentially only 12 years of auto manufacturing experience, and cementing the 328 in its place as an icon of pre-war racing. 426 cars made it off the production line before wartime brought that to an end, including some built under license by Fraser Nash in the UK, and nearly half of them have survived to the present day, a rather remarkable amount considering how many other cars in Germany were requisitioned, melted down, or otherwise destroyed between 1940 and 1945. Reportedly, quite a few 328s were squirreled away in the countryside, which saved them from daytime bombing raids, and presumably made them less convenient for melting down into Sturmgewehrs or Stukas. They reportedly also avoided requisition and use by Reich officials due to their high compression engines that got along extremely poorly with the sort of oily substance that Gestapo officers were known to secrete while driving. Or possibly because all they could get was low-quality wartime petrol, since the Luftwaffe received precedence for high-test gasoline. Let's go with the oily substance one. After the war, the 328 engine went back into production in the UK, built under license by Frazer-Nash as a continuation of their pre-war efforts, with it seeing use in a wide variety of vehicles, including, you guessed it, Frazer-Nash's, but also AC's, Cooper Formula 2 cars, and a whole bevy of other applications, some of which have been lost to history. It also provided the basis for BMW's first post-war vehicle engine, and 328s emerged from their barns and saw some race entries in the late 40s, but without any particularly notable successes. Also, perhaps unsurprisingly, BMW has remained very fond of the model in retrospect, not only reviving the nameplate for some 3 Series models in the past few decades, not that they have the same sorting pretensions that the original did, but they've also gone to considerable lengths to recover originals for restoration and museum display, including the Le Mans Streamliner, and they've also built a recreation of the Cam Rennlimousine after the original was scrapped following a bad wreck in the 1950s. They've also made a couple of heritage reboot-type concept car things in the last few decades, including this lovely concept coupe Mille Miglia and this even lovelier 328 Homage. There are currently 3 for sale, original 328s that is, not concept one-offs, on Hemming's website, ranging from just over $250,000 to US to about $250,000, depending on provenance and originality. My photos for this video come from last year's Le Mans Classic, as well as a whole bunch of public domain photos, and a remarkably high number from Pinterest of all places. Anyway, that brings us to the end of another video. These are getting really rather long, aren't they? Let me know if you prefer this format or the shorter, like 5 to 8 minute videos in the comments. But for this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube.
Like, comment, subscribe.
Actually, I just asked you to comment, so there's one of them. But anyway, it's International Whale Shark Day today, August 30th. So if you know any whale sharks, go forth and acknowledge them. If you don't happen to know any absurdly large pelagic pals, just think of the person you know who eats the most tiny shrimp or something. I think that's basically what whale sharks do. I'm sure Featherfin Films is going to have some corrections and clarifications on that, but that's much more his remit than mine. As a reminder, photos are for sale by donation at the Buy Me a Coffee link in the comments, details in the Chevy Decon Monza video from last week. Don't forget to sharpen your knives or request new video topics in the comments below, and that just leaves it for me to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and to wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.